Acting Speaker, I move that this House condemns the Labor state government for failing to deliver reliable and affordable energy to regional WA customers, leaving households, businesses and entire communities in the dark. Madam Speaker. It's fine. Madam Speaker, it used to be that government saw the provision of food, water and shelter as the necessities of life in the very early days, but of course in our modern world the reality is that electricity is in fact a critical necessity for our entire community and for households. And for most of us, we couldn't do what we do every day without electricity. And managing a reliable and stable electricity supply is now a key deliverable for any government in the world, and in particular in a dispersed state like Western Australia, where there is an added degree of difficulty in terms of doing that. Now, good electrical management or good management of the electricity network comes down to two key things. The first is reliability of supply, and the second is price. Now, in turn, those fundamentals of electricity supply reliability at a reasonable price require that the government is making a proper investment and a proper effort to maintain and improve the infrastructure that delivers that power to households. And that's why, on this side of the House, I took on the dual roles of energy and state development. The reason I did that is there's an intrinsic link between reliability of electricity supply and continuing to develop and improve supply of electricity around this state. And I might say I think it would behove the other side to do the same, because it's very readily apparent, and readily apparent because of the fact that this minister can head off for 2 weeks in a parliamentary sitting week, that the current Minister for State Development is not taking on that important role, in particular in the midwest of this state. Now, I do think it is worthwhile going over history. Our members on the other side like to go over history from time to time, and I think it's important to go over history and look at Labor's track record in relation to delivering both reliable but in particular cheap energy to the state of Western Australia. Now, there have been a couple of failures in relation to that. As I've said, currently we don't see the reliability, and certainly we don't see cheap electricity in this state, and that is critical for the future economic development of this state. Now, if you look at the government after 5 years in office, we hear constantly from the Minister for Energy. Well, in fact, we don't hear constantly from the Minister for Energy. We've had major power outages over Christmas. We had major power outages a few weeks ago in Kalgoorlie, again repeating the major outages over Christmas, 2 outages over 4 days, and we don't hear a peep from the Minister. The community doesn't hear a peep from the Minister, and in fact, an official from Western Power is sent up to, or across to Kalgoorlie, I should say, and they have to present, but the Minister is absent in providing any reasoned excuse or any reasons to that community for what happened. And I also say that there's no clarity from the government whatsoever on what they're doing to improve the reliability of the electricity system. Now, we all know, the Minister's made this point, you can't have an electricity system that's 100% reliable. We know that. I mean, to have 100% reliability would cost an infinite amount of money. It means that there are always some compromises to be made. But there's no doubt whatsoever that our system could be more reliable than it is now. And there's no doubt, and I will go through in a little bit of detail in this debate tonight, there's no doubt the government has the reports and the measures at hand, the measurements at hand that demonstrate that. But what's being done? And my great concern is that, in fact, we've got a bow wave of maintenance activity that is going to exacerbate this situation and make it worse and not improve the situation. Now, we know that bushfires and storms can cause major disruptions, but what I won't accept in this debate is this, and I think it is spin from the other side to say, oh well, the reason we have an unreliable electricity network is because of climate change. But it's just a nonsense argument, and that is the argument the minister's got. That's one of the factors that's making our electricity system more unreliable is climate change. Now, we know we have hot days, we have cold days. Our electricity system is designed and should be designed to withstand all of those full ranges of temperatures. And to say, well, yes, if we had 10 hot days, the system would have been reliable, but because we had 12 hot days, the system is unreliable, is a nonsense argument. The system has to be fit for purpose. Our system has to sustain electricity supplies across the range of temperature and other environmental conditions that occur. It can't be that every time it rains heavily or every time we have a hot day that we expect major power outages across the state. Now, unfortunately, the experience of our communities, and I can say particularly here in regional communities, and we just heard this discussion about a divide, well, there's a divide on power reliability in the state of Western Australia, and our regional communities are disproportionately adversely impacted by power outages, and that's evidence of a failure to deal with the issues that they face. And again, I've heard the Minister for Energy talk about this. He says, oh, well, as the power lines get longer, you're likely to experience more faults. Now, that's true. If you've got a power line that's twice as long, the probability of any particular fault, at least related to that power line, is twice. That's a fair enough contention. But that's why you have appropriate countermeasures in place at those distant locations, so that when you have those inevitable faults, that you have a countermeasure that deals with it. When I worked in industry for 20 years, no industry ever accepted the excuse, oh, well, you know, it's a more complex industry, or it's harder to get something there, therefore we'll just put up with the fact that it's going to be less reliable. Then it was your duty, and if you know, as a manager in the role I had, your duty was to make sure you put in countermeasures, you put in other things to make sure you countered that particular factor, that shortcoming, if you like. So we understand that if you're at the end of a very long power line, such as the city of Kalgoorlie, that getting power from in fact, really from Collie, there is the greater potential for disruption. That means you have a proper countermeasure in Kalgoorlie that can come up to speed very rapidly and restore power to that important community, and that's true for other communities as well. Now, again, I heard the member for West Swan Hills, I should say, a little while ago in a debate when we were debating some specific outages, made the comment that, yes, the government's doing some other things around remote power. Yes, they are. But are those sufficient, and are those being done in a timely manner? What the last 12 months would demonstrate is that we've seen a dramatic increase in power outages, and we've seen a dramatic increase in power outages since this government came to power. Now, it may be that, yes, there are other things being done. I'm aware of those other things being done. But the fact is those things that are being done are not having the effect of providing more reliable power for those communities. Now, it seems almost, and we hear these comments, which I'll refer to a little later in the debate, but we hear, you know, comments, you know, really to the effect of, oh, well, shucks, you know, you're out in the bush, you should have to put up with it. And we don't think that is appropriate. And certainly there should be a very clear plan for improving the reliability. After 5 years of government, we're not talking about a first-term government, we're not talking about you being in power for a couple of years when, you know, probably for something as big as the electrical network, you could say, well, you know, it was the other side, they didn't do the right thing and we're living with the consequences of their inaction. You're now 5 years, more than 5 years in, 5 years and 3 months into government. You know, you've got to own the problem by the time you get to there, and you've got to have a clear idea. And we have a minister, and I've said this in this place before, Minister Johnson, a hard-working minister, and, you know, studies hard and reads his notes and so on. So where's the plan? I mean, surely he's had time to formulate that and deliver it to the community, and we should be starting to see some significant improvement in that network. Now, as I say, you know, to be frank, I think the minister's comments to the people of Kalgoorlie and other areas in the Midwest has been frankly dismissive. Just to say, oh, well, it's because it was an extra bit of hot weather, or it was because of a protocol in terms of repair and so on. That was why it happened, and oh, well, we'll see what we can do about it, is not good enough. And what we see across all of regional Western Australia, and I know this from my old hometown, and this is true for most regional communities now, what most people are doing is actually buying generators. They're buying their own generators because the state-delivered power supply is so unreliable, and that is true, particularly, I might say, for people on farms, but it is true for people in the large regional towns. A very large number of them now have generators, and over Christmas it was those people that had generators that saved their Christmas lunch and their Boxing Day lunch as well, that they could actually have their friends over. Now that shouldn't be happening in a state like Western Australia. Now I've previously spoken about the residents of Horrocks. They kept a record of power supply outages, and they recorded 117 hours of outages in just 2 months over December. 117 hours of outages in just 2 months over December. Now, eventually, and only because of the enormous disquiet in the community, eventually Western Power delivered generators at the end of January, but meanwhile they'd endured 117 hours of outages. The trouble with these outages, members, and I apologise for my post-COVID cough, but the problem with these outages is that it's not just sort of one outage. You might say, well, you could live with that, but of course it's the 1 hour, the 2 hour. A lot of these outages don't even get recorded as being significant outages because they don't hit the threshold, which I'll talk about a little later. However, and of course what happens is, especially with modern refrigerators and modern electronic equipment, once you have 1 or 2 or 3 outages, it actually destroys it. It actually destroys the microprocessors in these things, so they don't work at all. And I might say, especially for larger equipment in food venues and the like, we had over that Christmas period in particular, where in a lot of communities weren't even recorded as significant outages, but in fact they had their equipment destroyed because there were multiple short outages over that period. And we heard about the people in Roleystone enduring 4 days without power beginning on Christmas Day, and that came in the wake of numerous disruptions during late November and early December. Now, you know, Roleystone's Perth. We're not talking about someone at the end of hundreds of kilometres of power lines. And as I've pointed out previously, you know, 12 months earlier they were enduring the same. They were having to endure the same sorts of outages, and you know, they shouldn't have to put up with that. And it was interesting in that previous the 2 years ago when they had those outages. I was up at a community meeting there. What they pointed out to me was, at the time, there was this massive bushfire down on the coastal plains down near near Kwinana. The wind was blowing from the west, it was heading up towards the hills. All of their phone towers went out. Now, many people these days only rely on mobile phones. There are many households, and I might say there's probably an age demographic here, but you know, I think of even in my own family, many households where people only have mobile phones. They don't have the landlines, but I might, and so those people had no phone contact. They were really disturbed. It was a very serious bushfire. It was a major bushfire at the time, threatening to come up the hills. And if you know, and I'm sure there are members here that are aware of Roleystone, you know, that area is heavily wooded. The hill slope coming up to that area is heavily wooded, and they were really concerned, but they had no way of getting emergency messages. Might I say, in a great number of townships, regional townships, and even in the extended parts of metropolitan Perth, when the power goes off, in fact, they lose even landline communication because the landlines go back to towers. And typically there's only, for many of them, they'd only have around 4 hours of electricity. So when they have an extended outage of 9 hours or so, they actually lose the communication altogether. They don't even have a landline. But typically the mobile phone towers are the ones that disappear first. Now the Midwest has especially suffered from power outages. Last summer, 17 Midwest locations endured 2,502 hours of blackouts. And the worst affected was Dongra, with 381 hours of outages. Now, I spoke and communicated with business owners in Dongra who've incurred enormous costs. due to regular power outages over recent years. And this is the problem. Yes, you might say, look, there's one event and you have a big outage, it affects a lot of people, and hey, that adds up to a lot of hours. But what is evident in these communities is they constantly endure this. They constantly endure outages, and over years and over the last few years. And that comes back to this government and what this government is doing. I mean, one business owner told of the costs involved in buying solar panels and a backup generator because they simply couldn't rely on the government-supplied power for their particular business. I mean, over that Christmas period in particular, when COVID vaccinations was still a very live topic, and obviously getting that third dose out was critically important. A lot of pharmacies and medical practices had to throw out all of their COVID medication because it was unrefrigerated for a number of hours, and therefore they couldn't safely use it. Now, and just to reinforce that, these are real impacts on people's lives. There was a letter to the West on the 2nd of June from Mr Jim Waddell in Port Denison. It said, Premier Mark McGowan should come and live in Port Denison, Dongara, if he thinks Western Power reliability is acceptable. The real sufferers are those who cannot afford generators, which is probably half the community. Because that has the generators, because the power supply is so unreliable. And there was another letter from Andre Nell of Karakan, and Andre goes through and he referred to the Jim Waddell letter. He said, Jim Waddell is quite correct about Western Power reliability. I reside between Ledge Point and Lancelin, which is less than 100 kilometres from central Perth. We lose power so regularly that I have a hotline to Western Power. I have complained about this to numerous politicians, but to no avail. Most people have generators, but this defeats the object. Maintenance is not existent, which is the main problem. Third world countries have more reliable power supplies. Now, I'm not quite sure whether that latter assertion is correct, but what I do know is that he's experiencing unacceptable power outages, and well beyond what is reasonable, given all the other excuses that are given. And people are being forced to buy their own generators because of that failure and walk away. Residences tell us they had 6 outages from Christmas to February that lasted a total of 76 hours. Port Gregory experienced more than 160 hours of outages in that period, and they didn't even get any backup power generators from Western Power during that. Residents of Springfield can't even access water when the power is out, and that's because they rely on groundwater for their water supply, and they can't get it. And that matter was raised in Parliament, and the Minister brushed it off with saying, oh, well, it's climate change, it's this, it's that, the normal excuses that get rolled out every time. Now, we all know that climate's changing, and as I pointed out before, the fact that whether climate is changing or not doesn't alter the requirement the government supplies reliable power, and equally, none of the temperatures that we have seen have been unusual. It may have been that there's a duration of temperatures is a bit longer than usual. It'll be interesting to see that detail. But the reality is none of those temperatures are unusual. They're not extreme. They're not something that has never been seen before. And it is a job of Western Power to supply that power. Now, there are many places in the world where the temperatures are far more extreme than the temperatures in the southern part of Western Australia, and yet adequate power supplies are supplied in those areas. So I think it's time for the Minister. Yes, the Minister can give us a lecture about climate change, and he's not going to get an argument on this side of the House about that. But the real point is, why can't our power network cope with what are normal temperatures that we experience during summer? It's not just in the Midwest, it's in the Southwest. I've spoken before about Kalgoorlie. I do feel especially sorry for the people in Kalgoorlie having endured those problems over summer when the Minister said, well, this was extreme and it was extremely hot and there were bushfire reasons. So what do we have a few weeks ago? No storms, no high winds, no high temperatures, and yet over 4 days we have 2 major outages in that city. and thousands of houses, probably around 20,000 houses on both occasions that were affected in a major regional centre that is critical to the economic well-being of this state. And it does demonstrate a lack of maintenance and new capital investment to do that. Now, the frustrating thing about Kalgoorlie is that Kalgoorlie has two large backup generators, two large diesel-fired gas turbine generators that, I'm told, can in fact handle all of the required load for Kalgoorlie and those near areas. And in both of those extended outages, and it was true at summertime as well, despite the fact that the government's paying a large sum of money to have that capacity in Kalgoorlie to back up the power supply network, those generators did not come on. They didn't come on. I mean, you had outages lasting up around 9 hours, and yet those turbines didn't come back on. Now, in estimates, this matter was discussed, and we heard that, well, they're slightly older and they take a little longer to start up, so Western Power doesn't make the decision to start those generators up straight away. And I will dwell on this point a little bit, but the problem is that decision's being made by some bureaucrats in Perth, so someone's on the phone going, what do you reckon? But the truth is it goes on for hours and hours and hours, and they're not started. And then when they try to start them, suddenly they discover their faults. Now, those are privately owned generators, but Western Power and the state government has a direct obligation to make sure that those generators can be started. Now, the minister gave us the excuse in estimates saying, look, we said to the ERA that we should be able to, Western Power should be able to invest more money and have these generators be more, start up more quickly. And it was a few $1 million. And the ERA came back and said, no, that's gold plating or whatever, and you can't do it. Now, but the minister stopped there. The minister stopped there. But in fact, the minister has absolute control over this. Absolute control. The ERA simply says that if you spend that extra money, you can't recover that money from customers. So what it means is that when you're justifying your next price increase, you can't say, when you're justifying the next price increase to the ERA, given that Synergy effectively is a monopoly power supplier, or it is a monopoly power supplier to houses, that you cannot charge that money back to customers. But the government, I mean, you've got Western Power paying hundreds of millions of dollars in dividend to the government, or in fact they're retaining it. The minister can simply write to Western Power and say, you will spend that money. It just means that Western Power can't recover that expenditure from customers. However, that money could come from the dividend. The government could actually put that money in from consolidated revenue, or that'd be a bit of a waste of time to go around that big circle. So the minister has... Absolutely. Yeah. As the member for Moore points out, when the government gave a direction on replacing wooden poles. And so you couldn't recover that from customers, but the government said, look, as a matter of public policy, we will invest this money, if you like, taxpayers' money, we'll invest it to improve the reliability of that system. Minister Johnson could have, or the previous minister, could have given direction at when the ERA came back and said, fair enough, then you're not going to win a fight with the ERA, but the government could have made the policy decision to, in fact, invest the money, pay extra money to those providers so that those machines could start up more rapidly and come on more rapidly in Kalgoorlie. So it's not right for the minister to hide behind the ERA or climate change or some other thing and to say that's why Kalgoorlie doesn't have reliable power. Kalgoorlie doesn't have the state-of-the-art, if you like, backup generation capacity. It has a system that's slower to start because the government chose not to invest the money in it. They had that choice. But the minister said, well, because I can't recover it from customers, I won't do it at all. Now, we know that in the regional areas, there is, in fact, public policy, and there are lots of areas where government makes investment in regional areas because there's an expectation that we'll have the same services and the same sorts of access to reliability in power, the access to clean water that people in metropolitan get. Now, it's easier to, relatively, per person, cheaper to deliver those services in Perth. So governments, both sides of this House, over time have accepted that sometimes we'll make an investment in those regional areas because we want people to have health services and other things, even though it costs more. So the government could have done it, but they chose not to do it. And that problem could have been solved. Now, this has been a problem for some time. The minister's been aware of it for some time. Excuse me. We need to, it does come back onto the minister. At the end of the day, the minister's in charge. There are some experienced ministers in this House, and I am absolutely certain, and I'm sure for a fact, that at times they've had to say, well, yes, I know that's what you say, but I'm directing you to do this, and I'll give you a written direction if I need to. Now, and so that is a matter that is within the government. It's not something that we have to wait for the end of the existing contract or whatever that matter could be resolved. Now, the ERA did do a report into electricity distributors showing that our reliability network is deteriorating, and that was in the ERA's report in 2021. And if we, on page 4 of that report, the ERA report shows that the number of customers affected by extended interruptions, and that means power outages of more than 12 hours, rose some 45,000, excuse me, they rose from 45,000 in 2016-17, which was the last year of the previous coalition government, to over 98,000 hours in 2019-20. Now that's, and last year it was some 70,000, which is 55% higher. This is what I mean, the network's getting worse, because those extended outages are increasing quite significantly. Now, we haven't had the commentary from the minister to explain why that is, or to explain what he is doing about it. Now, the other side of that to look at is 12 hours. I mean, 12 hours is a disaster. That means you've lost everything out of your freezer. Many people would have lost medications and the like. I mean, think about it. That's 70,000 outages for 70,000 residents having outages over 12 hours, which is an enormous number. And as I say, a massive increase on the numbers of when this government took power. Now, it is certainly concerning. Now, the ERA reports that Western Power attributed the high number of extended interruptions to severe storms, including Seroja, excuse me, which was 2 years ago. But we have storms every year. Yes, we have a storm and they come through, and you need a network that's not only resilient, but you need that backup capacity in those remote areas that will deal with the fact of when you have a power line out. Now, the power line from Three Springs to Geraldton was badly affected by Seroja. That's why you have backup power in that town, for example. And fortunately, there was a gas facility available that was originally going to be shut down, and fortunately was kept open, despite where the government wanted to go at the time. Now, it's interesting, in that same ER report, Western Power blamed storms for the high number of outages, and then there was a drop in the number of customers experiencing more than 16 interruptions, and that same report said that was due to fewer major storm events during the year. So I'm a little intrigued by that in terms of the report. But so there doesn't seem to be a consistency in that report itself. But the real point is we need a power network that is resilient to the usual weather conditions. We get storms every winter. We get hot weather every summer. Now, if you look at those, as I say, in regional areas, the standard is 16 interruptions. In the Perth CBD, the standard for good performance is 9 interruptions per annum. So it seems that we're quite prepared to accept the fact that people that live in regional areas just have got to put up with it. They've just got to put up with it, things that we wouldn't put up with in Perth, but we'll have to put that up as being reasonable. In the CBD, we find the average duration of interruptions is around 80 minutes, and even in the CBD, that's double what Western Power says is the acceptable standard. Double. So the average is 80 minutes, the standard is 30 minutes. Where's the plan from the government to close even that gap? Now, in the suburbs, the average duration of interruptions was over 300 minutes, which is more than twice the acceptable standard. And for rural areas, the standard average outage duration of 290 minutes, or nearly 5 hours. Last year there was 1,700 minutes, or nearly 29 hours. Now that's 6 times longer than the accepted standard. So you can see the measure of it, and what I'm trying to paint a picture for you of, and that is that if we get out into those regional areas, we have a lower standard, but government is accepting that we have a lower standard. Now, if we look at it even before Cyclone Seroja, the recorded rural average of nearly 1,400 minutes, which is more than 4 times the higher standard. So yes, Seroja as that one-off event had an impact, but nevertheless, even in the absence of Seroja, the average that was being measured was 4 times what is supposed to be the accepted standard. And the ERO report, when it's talking about performance in the suburbs, that Western Power has not met the standard of 160 minutes for urban areas in any of the 6 years that are reported. Now, I'm sure that some of your keen ears are picking up, and you're saying, well, that also includes the last year of the Liberal government in that period. But you know, this government was very critical. This new government was very critical of the previous government in this area. You've been in power for 5 years, but as I pointed out in relation to the metrics, your performance is getting worse and worse. Now, if we look at I do want to go through the state of the infrastructure report. Now, and this is what I made a comment earlier to say that the government has the information to hand to show what's going on. There's great information available, so that's a wonderful thing that we've got information, but the whole point of getting information is that you do something about it. If we go through that state of infrastructure report, the age profile is the thing that gives you a clue to the reliability of the ageing assets. And I will go through that report now, members, just for your own education. But if we go through all of the areas in this report, now I've heard comment before from the government saying, well, look, things are getting better because if we look at the number of assets actually exceeding the maximum age that we tolerate equipment, that number has reduced. But members, I can tell you, I'll go through the categories. So you look at the ageing profile of distribution piles. We've seen a dramatic, the 0 to 5, so this is new stuff coming into the system. So in all of these numbers go from the year 18, 19, 20, 19, 20, and then 2021. So that's the comparison before it. But you know, if we go to in the 0 to 5 years, there was a bit over 145,000 poles in the 0 to 5 category. I mean, that's reduced to about 9,000. 145,000 to 9,000 in that young category. And unfortunately, members, your keen eyes probably can't see this, but what happens is that the number of poles in the age profile in every other category essentially is going up. And that's a dramatic reduction. That means that new poles aren't coming into the system to replace those those old poles. I mean, if we look at serviceability profile by age and distribution of wood poles, they have a metric for the 41-year plus. Now, that's an old pole by any measure. Almost, in the graphic that's shown, more than almost 2/3 of those poles are listed as treatment required. Almost 2/3. And again, we see this increase. I mean, if we look at the profile distribution, since 1819, we've gone from about 12,600 poles in the 41 plus, so that's the oldest category, the oldest poles, to around 14,300. So a substantial increase of 1,700 in those older poles. You know, we go through, and I think it is worth going through it. You can look at the age profile of distribution cross arms in that, and the same trend, a dramatic reduction in the 0 to 5 and an increase in every age reduction. And interestingly enough, and I know there's been work on this, and I know there's been focus on this, but if we look at the figures for leakage currents resulting in unassisted pole top fires, it was 0.04% in 16-17, and it's 0.04% in 2021. So there's been no reduction in the pole top fires as a percentage of the total number of poles. If we look at the same thing in the age profile of distribution of overhead conductors, critical for reliable power supply. Again, a reduction in the 0 to 5 category. In the 51-year plus, now 51 years is supposed to be the limit. That's the maximum age for those conductors in those poles. Over that period I've discussed before, that's gone from around 12,300 to 15,300. So that's an increase of 3,000 in the 51 plus age group for those conductors. So these are the old conductors are more likely to short out, more likely to cause, if a conductor shorts out, it trips the power out, and then that is the thing that then cascades a lot of the issues in terms of restarting that network. We can go through it. If we look at transmission overhead conductors, again we see that. Interestingly enough, underground cables that are around, they talk here about the end of the reporting period, 52 kilometres of energised cable that make up the underground transmission network includes 9.3 kilometres of fluid-filled cables, 82% of which have exceeded their mean replacement life. So we wonder why we're seeing problems with the underground power network. 82% of the fluid-filled cables have exceeded their mean life. Now, and overall 38.5% of transmission underground cable network is beyond mean replacement life. Over a third of the underground cables are beyond their replacement life. And so that is that's not me making something up. This is the government's own report. This is the government's own report in terms of the state of infrastructure. Again, we can go through it. We can look at distribution transformers, critical, an increasing age. If we look at ring main units, exactly the same trend. Pole top switch disconnectors, which some of you might be fascinated by. There's an increasing trend in the maximum age, the 31 plus. Recloses, which are another exciting part of electrical networks for people who are fascinated with them, but critical for the ability to get a network back into gear. We're seeing an increasing age in those. There's sectionalisers, which is getting even, I guess, perhaps less familiar with people, but again, an increasing age profile, a significant reduction in the 0 to 5. And dropout fuses, which is critically important. There's again a significant increase in the age of those. The major power transformers, their life is said in the report to be 40 years. But in fact, one of the second largest category of those transformers is the 51 plus. So more than 11 years past, in fact, the useful life of those transformers. And again, what do we see? And that is an increase in those ageing assets. It's true for switchboards, circuit breakers, instrument transformers and the like. So, you know, I did want to dwell on that because, you know, what we hear are that, you know, this network's being maintained properly and improved. The data in this report shows that the age profile of all of that critical equipment in our electricity network is in fact getting older. That means there's underinvestment. Now, I will say a positive for the government, not to be entirely doom and gloom about it. If we look at metal poles collapsing, members, you'll be pleased to know there's been a substantial reduction in metal poles collapsing, and that's gone from 52 to 7, so that's a good achievement, but that doesn't do much for the reliability of the power networks in regional areas. Now, I think that it does reinforce the point, you know, it's sort of disappointing that where money is available, it's not actually being spent to upgrade our system and invest and improve in our system. So that independent review that the ERA conducted, that I mentioned before, said that the government had invested, or the Western Power had invested, $368 million less than it had planned to and had been approved to. So they've got approval from the ERA to invest in upgrading, modernising the system, making a capital investment. They spent almost $400 million less than they planned to. Now, some of you might say, well, yippee, that's a government being frugal. But what those statistics I mentioned before demonstrate is that, in fact, that's at the cost of the asset life for that equipment. And you know, the Minister, there was an independent review into the Christmas outages, the power outages, and a number of recommendations were made in relation to that. And I'm intrigued, and it's a pity the Minister obviously had other commitments, but I am interested to hear how that has progressed, because we've heard very little about the progress against those recommendations, which would see a reduction in the major power outages we had over Christmas. And I think that we need to, in fact, we need to hear from the Minister, because the Minister spends a lot of time being highly critical of members on this side. I think it's time for him to explain in detail what he's actually doing. And in relation to the problems, I think it is clear that those problems are getting worse. Now, you know, Western Power derives an enormous amount of money from the customers in Western Australia. I mean, their revenue last year was $1.8 billion. Now, the capital works budget was $800 million, so a gap of $1 billion above that. Now, Western Power spent $746 million on capital investment last year, and so this is outside the year past the ERA report. And that's another $145 million underspend last year. So you're getting up to, $550 million in round terms of underspend in the network. And Western Power has enormous financial capacity. Now, the Western Power hasn't paid dividends for a couple of years, and there's a combined capacity of some $450 million that Western Power can spend on upgrading those regional and rural systems. They can go and spend that money. As I've said, they can seek direction from the Minister where the ERA doesn't justify them recovering it from customers. But there is more than adequate money in Western Power and in this government to deal with that. Now, as I said, we've seen nothing from the Minister redirecting, or at least directing Western Power in relation to this matter and making sure that we see an improvement in that reliable power supply. I do want to now turn to costs, because affordability was one of the issues that was the topic of this debate. Now, I will go back a little bit in history here, because I do think it's important, but back in 2005, in the Gallop government, there was I think it was a lie sold to the people of Western Australia. In 2005, the Labor government sold its reform agenda on the basis that there would be 8% lower electricity prices. And that was where we saw the disaggregation of the network, the disaggregation between distribution and suppliers and sellers. What did we see once that legislation came through? Pretty well immediately that legislation was promulgated. Pretty well as soon as that legislation was promulgated, what the public was then told by this Labor government is that we wouldn't see an 8% decrease, we would see a 100% increase. We would see 10% per annum increases over 10 years. That was what we were told to get that back. So that was the cost of that disaggregation that was put forward by the Labor government at the time. Now, again, members on that side make a great point of saying, oh, well, the Liberal Party supported that, because the Liberal Party at the time accepted the assertions of the Minister, and we heard today in answer to Dorothy Dixon, the Minister for Energy, saying, well, you know, we're very clever because we've got all of these Western Power advisors, we've got all of these people that give us all this clever advice, and you're all dumb on the other side because, you know, you don't understand the detail that I have to hand because of all of the great advisors I've had. Now, you know, lest we be wary on this side, what we saw, well, I am feeling a bit weary, I'll tell you that, member, for free. Lest they're out working hard for their electorates, I hope, doing the job. But lest we be wary on this side of the Minister's statements today, saying of the great wisdom that he has had and he has at hand. We were reassured this back in 2005 by the Govt government, and we didn't oppose that legislation at the time. And then, lo and behold, what do we see? That 100% increase proposed by Govt. Now, when the Liberal government came into power, the decision they made was, and again this is mentioned on the other side, they made that this was ridiculous to have this continuous cut, so they made instead made a couple of larger cuts, larger increases, I should say, in power, which is referred again by the Minister for Energy. He loves to come into this place and say, "You lot are useless," and look at your cuts. Look at the increases you made. Those increases were the total product of the Govt reforms, so-called reforms, where it locked in 10% increases over 10 years, 100% increases over 10 terms, over 10 years. That was the increase. That was the increase that came out of those reforms. Now, we wore the odium of that, but that was a complete consequence of those reforms. And that's why I'm going through that history, because I think it's important in this place that we hear the whole story and not part of the story as given by the Minister for Energy. Now, what we've seen under this, since this government's come to power in 2017, I have limited time, members, and I do want to get through a little bit of material. In 2017, electricity was 26.5 cents a kilowatt hour, or thereabouts, and now it's to rise to 30 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, that's a 13.5% increase. Now, we know that inflation has increased, at least for part of this year. We've seen an inflation spike because of what's happened in Ukraine and because of some other issues in relation to energy. But that is substantially above the inflation rate since this government has come to power, substantially above the inflation rate, because we had years of 1%. And it's continuing to increase. Now, we hear the government talk a lot about, well, we've done this rebate, you know, we've got this $400 rebate we're going to give to customers, we've got the $600 rebate that we gave last time. But the fact is, the underlying charges are going up and up and up and up. And the government rapidly recovers that gap. So yes, it's a one-off sugar hit, and I might say in both cases, you know, no surprise, these were timed immediately before an election. we saw one sugar hit immediately before the state election, and then we saw the other sugar hit immediately before the federal election. And given the Premier was so present in that campaign, little wonder the government's using the same trick that they used in the state election to buy favour with the electorate. But you know, again, some of these underlying charges that have gone up, the massive hike on daily supply charges of 95%. So in 2017, when the government came in and further rises, they've increased that charge from 48.6 cents to 107.8 cents. A massive increase, and that's a charge no one can escape over that time, hitting household budgets. Now, it's very, very clear that there's no plan by this government in relation to lowering prices, and what we're seeing is forecast increased price after increased price. And as I say, despite these sugar hits, the underlying price has increased and increased, and we're not seeing any option to lower that. Now, if we look at the you know, so it is a little bit of a fallout from those other changes. One of the things we saw with the Labor Party was that we actually saw the government giving up energy capacity to bring other players into the system, which again substantially increased the price of electricity. In fact, it's one of the things that's led to the shutdown of the Collie power stations, and that is preferentially taking power from third parties, from non-government sources, has made those power stations in Collie completely unviable. And so we see those public assets now being mothballed, and I might say, I would imagine at a significant written down value. I think it's, look, I would well and truly stand corrected on this, but I think there's something like about $600 million still on the books for those assets. But as I say, I'm happy for members to correct me on that matter of detail, but nevertheless, very substantial value of asset that is going to be written off. Now, I might say when you have sensible regulation, as in the court years 1993 to 2009, the price rise, one price rise of 3.7% in 15 years. And why was that? Because sensibly the government allowed third parties to bid in for power requirements above the generation capacity of the state-owned assets. And so that was what are you talking about, Varanus Island, member? I think you might be doing a little bit of verbling there, or at least misleading to the House. Now, that was good management of that particular plan, and as I say, the Labor plan was led directly to that doubling of the prices, and that's something that contributes to the enormous cost of living in households in Western Australia today. A failed reformation process that led to massive costs, and something that we should be worried about now. And I do want to spend a few moments to dwell on the Collie plan. You know, it was really interesting to hear from the Minister today in relation to this, and a lot of spin. And you would know the Minister was very critical of our side during the previous state election over our plan, but in the larger part, the plan that the government's bringing in is the plan that we'd suggested. And I might say, just on some other notes, the hydrogen highway was a direct copy of our plan, and also the electric charging highway and infrastructure was a direct copy of our plan from the state election, but we'll let that pass. But, you know, there's a major challenge facing us now. We know that, you know, we're going to see at least AEMO, have an excellent report for those of you that are interested in electricity. AEMO, an excellent organisation, independent organisation, which is interesting in that they can actually give you independent comment. You know, have their statement of opportunity where they go through and talk about the challenges going forward. Now, we heard assertions from the Minister today in relation to this, and discussions he'd had with AEMO about the capacity required. But as I pointed out in question time today, if you look at the MUJA 7 and 8, and also the blue water power stations. Now, previously, up until the announcement the government made yesterday, those power stations were seen to continue into the future, and that's reflected in the AEMO Statement of Opportunity report here, where they go through and look at all of the generation. They look at the increase of rooftop solar. They're saying by 2031, that'll increase to around 4 gigawatts, I should say, 4,000 megawatts, or a little bit more than that, rooftop solar, so a massive increase in that capacity. What they're saying with the planned shutdowns and looking at all of the generation that's available, there's about 3.5 gigawatts, I think, of non-coal, non-renewable generation capacity, mostly gas turbines and diesel generators that are available in the system. If you look at all of that capacity, and they look at peak demand in the system, where they make assumptions, and of course you have to make an assumption at some stage. For example, at night, and this is especially at night time, there are times when, obviously at night time there's no sun, but there are times when there's no wind, and there's no wind over extensive areas, not just in one little isolated part of the state, of the whole state. So in fact there are times when no renewables are available, and in fact all of the power has to be supplied, or nearly all of the power has to be supplied by backup generation. And when they look at that, they say in 2031 there's only 171 megawatt above that forecast peak demand. Now the Muja 7 and 8 is a 422 megawatt of combined capacity. That's what the AEMO site listed as, so that's the reserve capacity that has. And if we look at Blue Water 1 and 2, the AEMO site adds up to 434 megawatts of capacity available from those stations. So that's a combined total of 856 megawatts. Now, if you subtract the 171 megawatts, which is the available peak, it leaves a gap to close of 685 megawatts generation capacity, and that's really substantial. And the thing I asked the Minister today was, what's his plan? And the Minister had great delight in pointing out my many failings and telling me that he'd published his plan. Now, I got my staff to search extensively because I had not seen a plan, and I've gone through, and as far as I can see, the plan is this press release released yesterday, and this press release goes through and it talks about the government's going to spend various monies on things, and they're going to invest an estimated $3.8 billion in new green power infrastructure. If there's one message I'd like the other side of the House to get, promised money is not a plan. It's just money. We hear this in health. I'm just fascinated. You know, we hear from the Premier to say, oh, well, we spend more money per person in Western Australia on hospital beds, but Western Australia's got the lowest number of hospital beds per person in the country. So all it means is that our hospital beds are massively more expensive in any other state. So if I was the Health Minister and the Premier, I'd be looking at how do we manage more efficiently the cost of hospital beds in this state, because that's the problem, clearly. Saying you're going to spend an amount of money is not solving a problem. I hear this in housing. We promised this much money. That doesn't solve the problem. And saying you're going to allocate a certain amount of money is not a plan. A plan is that we're going to install this much battery backup, we're going to have estimated this much hydrogen capacity in the system, we're going to build this in Collie, or we're going to build it at Greenock, or we're going to build it wherever. That's a plan, and that's what I asked the Minister for, was a plan. But instead the Minister says, you're a fool because you don't understand that I've got a plan, I've told you the plan. This press release is not a plan. It's a statement of general intent that the Minister says he's going to invest a certain amount of money and that he's going to do something. He's going to do something about it. And you know, it was really, we've had debate in this place before in terms of power reliability. If you're going to bring green energy from the Midwest into the Swiss, into the metropolitan area, then you have to have upgrade the current power line, which is a lower voltage line from Three Springs to Geraldton. You have to have a plan to upgrade the 330 kV tie from Three Springs to Geraldton. Now, you know, the minister, I was really disappointed in the minister on this. I had a meeting with AEMO on the 2nd of June. I said to AEMO, did you ever say that to bring that power down you'd have to have 3 power lines? You know what they told me? No. They have never said that you have to have triplication of that line. They said they would be perfectly satisfied with upgrading that line to 330 kV to match the standard of the line that goes to Three Springs. And furthermore, they said they'd never given that advice. I am extremely disappointed that the minister would mislead the public of Western Australia and this place in relation to that matter, because they were very clear to me on that matter.
Thank you, Member for Cottesloe.